So here we go, Section 2, the Spanish-American War. Focus question, what were the causes and the effects of the Spanish-American War? And one of the first things you should be able to do is explain the causes of the Spanish-American War. And so when we look at it, one is Spain is an imperial nation in decline. If you go all the way back to the 1500s, Spain had built a tremendous overseas empire, which had been slowly kind of slipping away. And by the end of the 1800s, they're really kind of hanging on for dear life. And so there's a couple of factors that are going to kind of come into play here. One is Spain is in decline, and two, Cubans want their freedom. And for the United States, where we kind of get involved, is Cuba geographically is extremely close, roughly 70 miles from the southern tip of Florida, and economically we'd always been kind of connected to Cuba. And so because of the geographic closeness and the economic ties, it's kind of natural that Americans are going to kind of feel a need to get involved maybe a little bit. On top of that, you have Martí, who kind of rises to the top as a leader, and he is using a very successful strategy, guerrilla warfare, which is going to cause the Spanish to retaliate and use some pretty brutal methods to try and put it down. And so many Americans are beginning to support the Cuban cause, and the longer the war goes on, the more the support grows in the United States. On top of that, many Americans are linking the Spanish-American struggle to our own struggle for independence. Here we are, a kind of a weenie colonial group who is fighting against a superpower, and the Cubans are kind of in the same boat. We dislike the harsh tactics. And probably one of the more important things for some of the leaders in the country is we're worried about losing some of the money that we have invested and some of the money that we could potentially lose from this. So those things are factoring in. Probably if McKinley is kind of dragging his feet, he doesn't really want to get involved. And it's the yellow press that's really going to inflame public opinion and kind of press McKinley into action. And so there's competing newspapers going on. Hearst is probably the most to blame here, and this yellow press and journalism gets its name from a Yellow Kid comic strip. Most of the comic strips were black and white, and there was one that was printed in this yellow ink, and so it kind of grabbed your attention, and that's what yellow journalism is. It's these flashy, unsubstantiated newspaper claims that cause people to pick it up and read it. So it's kind of like these headline wars in a way. Because of this, McKinley feels the need to send a warning, which he does to Spain. And then you have the Maine blowing up, and Spain is blamed for it. And later on, it's evidence shows that it's really a faulty design and the use of poor coal that leads to it. There's a series of ships of the same class that had very similar problems and very nearly blew up and sank. So this is something that, it had nothing to do with Spain or a landmine. It had to do with the fact that we used cheap coal and didn't do a very good job of designing our ships. So, but anyway, nation goes to war. Remember the Maine becomes the rallying cry. Because of the Maine, Congress is kind of forced into action. They pass a series of 4 resolutions, and perhaps the most important is the Teller Amendment, because the Teller Amendment basically says that we really aren't interested in taking over Cuba when the war is over. And so in a lot of ways that prevents us from doing the one thing that maybe many Americans had kind of hoped we would have done, which is to take over Cuba. So it was probably a good amendment, but it was one that probably Congress regretted a little bit later. If we identify the major battles, I mean, there really are not a ton of major battles, to be quite honest. I mean, we're looking at a war that really, in the grand scheme of things, only lasts a few months. And if you look at the actual major battles, there aren't very many, and it's pretty short-lived. But Americans rally in support of the war. Something like 250,000 Americans signed up, something like that. So you get a great number of people who are interested in serving their country and doing what they feel is their duty and helping free the Cubans. Dewey sails to the Philippines, and this is an extremely pretty short war. He defeats the outdated Spanish Navy at Manila Bay relatively quickly, and on land you see Emilio Aguinaldo, who leads the Filipino nationalists and joins American forces in driving the Spanish out. And then the Philippines is essentially over fairly quickly. U.S. forces win in Cuba. American forces are poorly trained and lack supplies, and you see more people die from the disease from battle. It begins in early June. It's over in early July, and probably the most important battle is San Juan Hill, and Teddy Roosevelt leads the Rough Riders on a charge up San Juan Hill. And the Rough Riders are an interesting group because they're a mixture of Western cowboys and Harvard grads. So the two groups of people that Teddy Roosevelt had hung out with, the cowboys out in South Dakota and the Harvard grads they went to law school with, it's really kind of a bit of an eclectic group in a lot of ways. And it's kind of an interesting story to see this and how it all worked out. If we look at the consequences of the war and include the debate over imperialism, if we look at the effects, the Treaty of Paris, Spain had given up Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and it sold the Philippines to the United States. And suddenly we find ourselves in the position of being a bit of an overseas imperial power. And this leads to a pretty heated debate. McKinley uses justifications to hold on to the Philippines and to hold on to some of these places, and the justifications that he makes ranges from an economic argument to a moral argument. And to be honest with you, in my opinion, the moral argument doesn't always hold up to scrutiny very well. And you see Twain and William James Bryan arguing against it, and they're not the only two by any stretch of imagination. There's an anti-imperialist league that forms, but there's quite a few leaders that see us being hypocritical, or see the United States as being hypocritical, and they also feel we're becoming a little bit too much like maybe Europeans, and the whole point of being American is not to be European, I guess. So that's kind of grating at them a little bit. And for Mark Twain, he really struggles with the irony and the hypocrisy of some of this stuff. So anyway, America eventually assumes this new role in the world, because if we're going to hang on to these places, we have to defend them. And so that's going to expand our influence to other places. We're now kind of in a heated competition with Europe. And many people in America, especially economic leaders, want to see us gaining access to new trade. So that's this section.